Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Sunday Conversation series. I am Justin K Prim from the Institute of Gem Trading in Bangkok, and I want to thank all of you guys for being here today. Looks like we already have 90 people in the room, and it just keeps on growing. So I'll just say hi for a couple of minutes while everybody gets into the room. We're very, very excited to have Richard Hughes here with us tonight. I think you guys are also excited because I've gotten many, many emails about this talk. With questions, with comments, with everything. So we're super excited to have Richard with us tonight. If you guys haven't been to one of these talks on Sunday yet, this is the fourth one we've done, and we've got plenty more coming up. So I've got talks scheduled for the rest of this month and even starting to look at next month. So yeah, if this is your first time with us, then welcome and thanks for being here. We've been doing this now, yeah, for about a month, just as a way of giving us something to do and connecting with, some of our peers and colleagues around the world that we don't often get to see, especially for us being here in Bangkok, where we're a little bit removed from, our American and European and every other friend. So the webinars have been a really fun way for us to kind of keep community together and keep conversations going. And really what I think it's turned into, between all the different people that are doing all these different webinars, it's turned into a really cool new way that all of us are sort of tuning in to each other, to the projects that we're working on, or the passionate, endeavors that we've been, spending our time with. So yeah, I've been really happy to be able to facilitate some of these talks and get to know some people better, people from distant connections that we've been able to talk to. It's been really, really great. So yeah, it looks like we have most of the people in here, and it looks like we've got people from all over the world. I'm looking at the chat, and yeah, just everywhere. Ohio, Spain, Poland, Hong Kong, of course, Bangkok. Lots of friends here in Bangkok. Fallbrook, Maine, UK, more Spain. Wow, we have several people from Ohio here. That's interesting. Connecticut. Yeah, so thanks all you guys for being here. Belgium, San Francisco, Australia, Canada. I know in Australia it's very, very late. Sorry about that, guys. London, Canada, Florida, Athens, Netherlands, Rome. Wow, just we got the whole world in here with us. So this is so cool. As always, we're just so happy that everybody is, you know, taking the opportunity to sit with us and giving us your time for this evening. We really appreciate it. So for all of you guys, I don't know if anyone in here doesn't know Richard Hughes, but I'll just give them the most briefest of introductions. So Richard is the founder of, or let's say co-founder of Lotus Gemology here in Bangkok, as well as, being very reputable as a writer and writer of Ruby and Sapphire book, among many, many, many other books and publications and articles. And if you've never seen his name before, then after this talk, you need to go out there and look him up, because wow, he's just got a ton of info that he's put out to the world. And so I wanted to get him in here tonight and talk about some books and writing and reading and all this kind of stuff that we love to do and we love to hear about. So if you're ready, Richard, come on in and we can get going. So Richard's going to be, I think, on both his computer and his iPad, because he's going to be showing us around his library a little bit, because our theme tonight is books. So we're going to be talking about old books, new books, books we're writing, books that we love, and everything like that. So yeah, Richard, whenever you're ready, come on in.
My computer working as well as my iPad.
Okay, I think I can. I'm going to ask you to start the video, software wise. So maybe something just popped up. Since you have two, I'm not sure if I'm clicking. There you are. Cool. And
Okay.
And let me just stop this thing. Okay. Welcome.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here, and hello to everybody around the world. This is a lot of fun. This is the first time I've done this. And thanks very much to Justin for providing the forum. And I'm looking forward to this evening talking a little bit about books and gemology and anything else that people would like to speak about.
Yeah. I know that you are sort of maybe casually known as a sort of the king of ruby and sapphire, or at least, you know, the book that you've written is regularly referred to as the Bible of ruby and sapphire. But I figured that maybe you always have to talk about ruby and sapphire, so I thought I would try and flip it a little bit tonight and talk about something else. And I know from our conversations in the past that you're a big book lover, a reader, a collector. So I just thought, you know, we don't often get to hear from book nerds in the gemology community. So I thought that'd be kind of a fun topic for us to explore tonight. So I know you've got quite a collection at home, and we can see a bit of it behind you. Do you mind just giving us a little walkthrough of your library that's at your
Oh,
house?
sure. I'm sitting here in my, let me see if I can switch the camera around here. Okay, I'm sitting here in my office, and this is where I do a lot of my writing. And I try to keep the important books close at hand. And so these are books about books. Probably for book collectors, these two volumes here are the most important, which is Johnson Kankis' Bibliography of Gemology. And so for collectors, those are the things that we often use when we want to know about particular books, how rare they are, and so forth. And I have a few other things here, Arts of Asia magazines, and then a lot of other bibliographies. Again, a lot of books about books, book design, and so forth. And I never get involved much with diamonds, and so that's why I keep these books up on the top shelf where I can't reach them.
And so the books about books, does that come in more handy when you're doing research, or just if you're as a collector?
Well, they in both cases. For doing research, of course, it all starts with trying to find out what has already been known. And so that means going in to try to figure out, using bibliographies and so forth, figure out what's already been discovered. And so that's a big part of research, is to do that. And then the periodic literature is very important as well. And so over in the other part of my office here is where I keep a lot of the periodic literature. And so I have things like the mineralogical record, and there are things like this that are really, really nice. Let's see if I can find that. So this is a book that the Mineralogical Record published on books about minerals, and that's very, very nice. And then I have other periodic literature, journals from the GIA, from Germany, the old Gemologist magazine, which you were asking about before.
Mm-hmm.
I have all the old Gemologist magazines.
And some of these periodicals go all the way back to like the 30s and 40s, right? I know that the Mineralogical Record and the Gemological are quite old.
Yes, and so probably the most important periodical for gemologists is Gems and Gemology magazine. And so I have a complete run of that. And thankfully, the GIA has made all of that available free of charge in PDF format. And so everyone can download the complete collection of Gems and Gemology. And I look to that more often than any other periodical because of the quality of the publication.
Yeah.
But in addition, I have the Journal of Gemology from the UK, and we have a lot of those in our office as well. And then various other kinds of periodicals. including, I don't know if any of you have ever studied for the GMA. Let me just show you this. This was the volume that I used when I studied for the FGA exam. And for all of you people who love color illustrations and so forth, well, when I was studying gemology, I had to walk uphill both to and from school. This was the course notes back when I studied gemology. And I think, well, here's an example of one of the few illustrations that was included in the entire course back then. There was a grand total of 1, 2, 3, 4 black and white plates, and that was it. So we've come a long way in studying gemology since that time. And now the course materials from both the GIA and the GMA are far better. And so you can consider yourself blessed, because it's a lot easier to study gemology today than it was back then. But these are some of the books that that I keep in my office, and then I have things of a general nature, books on photography, which is something that I've been interested in because I travel a lot, and in trying to document my travels, I try to take good pictures. And so to do that, I've tried to learn by looking at other professional photographers and see how they do it and try to learn from them. And so there's a lot of books on photography, including some classics, Sebastião Salgado, things like this, Steve McCurry, of course, and other well-known photographers. And then I have books of various other types on minerals, a lot of books on Burma, because Burma is such an important source of gemstones. And so I have a lot of books about Burma. I also have books about politics. It's something that I've been interested in since I was younger, coming of age during the Watergate era. And so I realized you have to pay attention to politics. And
this is like a never-ending collection.
A lot of other books about Southeast Asia, India, Marco Polo's travels around the world. And so, and of late, I've got a lot of books on Chinese art and China. And you can see some of those there. And I have a few books on gemstones as well, shockingly.
So do you find having a good sort of foothold in history and, you know, regional, an understanding of different regions is really important for when you're, you know, even if we're talking about something like gemology where it's somewhat science-based, do you think it's really important to have that historical reference point?
No, absolutely. Because everything has a history. And so if you're going to write about a subject, you have to try to understand the history. I don't think things happen in a vacuum. And so you should try as best as you can to understand where things come from. And that means digging into the history. Yeah. And so I have a lot of books on history, and of course, the history of gemology. These are books on ruby and sapphire. For example, this is a book by Edmund Framey, and he was one of the first people to synthesize synthetic ruby.
Hmm.
And so you can see this was a book that he wrote called The Synthesis of Ruby. And as a collector, of course, you love it when you can get a book that's been signed by the author, as this one has. And this book is interesting as well because it has many color plates. And so these are synthetic rubies. And so that's a particularly collectible book.
Yeah. And so for you as a collector as well as a researcher and a writer, is there a line between, you know, collecting and actually using? Are there some books that you have that are so collectible that maybe you wouldn't really want to reference because, you know, because you damage them or something?
Well, there are books that, for example, the Framey book, I actually have two copies. I have one copy that's a photocopy, which you can see here. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would be the book that I would pull off the shelf if I was trying to look something up.
Okay.
In the latest Arts of Asia magazine, Eric Hoffman and I have written a book about collecting books on Jade. I'll just grab that and show you. And so this just came out, and we have an article in it called Hidden Treasure, which is about collecting books on Jade. And at the end of the article, this is the actual article, and at the end of the article, we have a section on collecting books and the kind of things that you look for. There are some books that are exceedingly rare, and those kind of books, you might only have the opportunity to buy them once in a lifetime. There are other books that are easy to find. And so in the back part of this article, there's a whole section on the kind of things that people look for when they're buying books.
Okay.
And certainly the rarity factor is a big one. There are some books that are exceedingly rare and expensive, and the material in the book might not be that interesting. For example, Manimala by Tagore. I've had several copies of that over the years, and this is a reprint of it here. And most of the information from that book comes out of the Hindu Puranas, the Garuda Purana, which is shown here. And the information is copied almost verbatim. And then the other information in the book came from other common gemological books that were available in the late 19th century as Tagore was putting this together. So the information itself is not that rare, but original copies of the book are exceedingly rare. And nowadays, a fine set of the 2 volumes of Manimala goes for somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000.
Wow.
And so there are books that are really, really rare, but the information may not be that scarce.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are other books that are exceedingly hard to find, and the information may be extraordinarily valuable and not available anywhere else. And so that's kind of the fun of book collecting, is to find those little bits of hidden treasure where you find something that other people have not known about for a long time, or it was known at one time and then was forgotten.
Yeah. And so as you were getting into starting to build this epic collection of books that we're looking here, did you have to learn how to collect books? Because obviously book collecting is a world unto itself. Did you have to sort of study that whole world a little bit, or did it just come piece by piece?
Well, it's like anything. If you're interested in a subject, then you want to know more and more about it. And I was fortunate that I came to know John and Marge Sinkankis, and they were probably the greatest collectors of gem books in the world. And they assembled a huge library in their home in San Diego. And every 2 months or every 6 weeks or so, they would put out a list of books for sale. And so I was on that list, and everyone who collected books back then would eagerly await the list that came from John and Marge Sinkankis to see what kind of things they had found and then to try and buy them. And the result of all their work in that field was the 2-volume bibliography of gemology, which is something that anyone who, if you want to know about gemology, if I could pick one book that you should buy, it would be that one, because that unlocks all of the other literature on gemology. And that book, as I said over here, that's probably the book that I consult more than any other. And that's this book here.
So I'm just going to put that into the chat for anybody who's interested in looking it up. Have you, during your research and your collecting, have you found many books that they missed, that were before that bibliography was published? Or
Absolutely. And they didn't miss much. I'll say that. They didn't miss much. But every notation in the bibliography will have something at the end, and it will say JSL, which stands for John Sinkankis Library. And if he never had it, it would say not seen. And I've sort of followed the same pattern in all of my bibliographies, where I always have a notation that is RWHL if it's a book in my library, or not seen, or seen if it's something I've seen but I don't own.
Okay.
And so, yeah, there wasn't much that got by John and Marge.
And so when they eventually passed on their collection, if I'm not mistaken, where is that collection now?
It's now at the GIA, and it is the rare book collection at the GIA in Carlsbad.
Okay.
Before John and Marge died, the GIA purchased their collection.
Okay.
And John and Marge were very careful. They would generally put a book plate in the front of their books when they got something. And I have a few items that have John and Marge's book plate in the front of them. I can't think of any of them off the top of my head right now, but I do have a few of those.
Okay.
And so that's something that makes books more collectible, if they can have some kind of connection to a well-known person.
Yeah. And so far, obviously we've seen many shelves so far, but I know you've got one shelf that is maybe, to me, the most extra special shelf, which is the really old bookshelf.
Yeah, I have a shelf of older books here, and it has different kinds of things. This is actually a limited edition of the 3rd volume of John Sinkankis's Gemstones of North America. Okay. And then I have books by Rosenthal. who was the king of the pearl before the cultured pearl came along. And his books were published in the early 20th century. And at that time, it was common to publish things in a soft cover because it was assumed that the buyer would have them bound themselves. And so Rosenthal's books, you will find them in a huge variety of bindings, many of them done very, very nicely because France was the center of fine bookbinding and still is to a degree. And so here's 3 different books by Rosenthal, 4 different books, each one having a slightly different binding. This is something that some people may recognize, particularly since we're having an economic meltdown right now. This is a book written, it's an English translation of a very famous German book by a guy named Agricola. And the translation was done by a man and his wife. The man actually became the president of the United States at one point, Herbert Hoover. Mm-hmm. And so he was a book lover along with his wife. They were involved in mining. I think they were both mining engineers, if I'm not mistaken. And so they had this beautiful book published in about 1912. I think it was, 1912. And this is a book that's not super rare. You can find copies for several $100s each. But he had it done in vellum, which is the old style of bookbinding, using the skin of is it a calf or a goat? I can't remember, or a sheep. Anyway, and this copy is signed by him, Herbert Hoover. And it's one of the more collectible books on gems and minerals, very famous for the woodcut illustrations. Now, if you want to have an original copy of this, which originally was done in Latin in the 1500s, of course, this will be many, many, many thousands or tens of thousands of dollars if you can find a copy. Yeah. But you can easily find copies of the Hoover edition, and it's something really nice if you like books, and you know, it's a nice piece of history.
Yeah. So in your old book shelf, what's the oldest book that you have? What's the oldest book in your whole collection?
The oldest book I have is an English translation of Pliny's Natural History.
Okay, so this is a pretty important work for the history of mineralogy and gemology.
Yeah, for those people who don't know, Pliny was a Roman, and he wrote one of the first encyclopedias back 2,000 years ago. And you can see the title page of this. This is one of the earliest English translations. I think this is the second edition of the first English translation. So Pliny's history of the world contained, I think, 35 or 37 different books, and 2 or 3 of them dealt with gems and minerals. And so it's an extremely important source of information because it's 2,000 years ago. What did people know about gems and minerals? And Pliny was the consummate scientist, literally died with his boots on. He died witnessing the eruption of Mount Vesuvius back some 2,000 years ago in Pompeii. Thankfully, his book survives, and it's been translated into a number of different languages. And so this was the earliest English translation, which I find fantastic because not only the information that's there in the book, but also the Old English descriptions.
Yeah.
And so it's really quaint to read the Old English. And I actually used a quotation from this on the back of my 1997 book on Ruby and Sapphire, and about Pliny talking about digging holes in the ground. And he said if there was any evil spirits inside the earth, certainly this would release them.
Luckily, we don't have to deal with many evil spirits in the world of mining, but maybe for Pliny, it was a different story.
Yeah. The nice thing about these old books is that they were made with linen or hemp paper. And as a result, the paper today is just as pliable and fresh as it was the day it was printed.
Yeah, it looks so new considering that it's what, 300 or 400 years old.
Yeah. And the problem is that in the 19th century, they got away from using linen or hemp as paper, and they started using acid to produce paper. And so particularly from about the 1880s onward through the early part of the 20th century, with time, the paper becomes very brittle and it actually breaks. And so books like those published by Streeter and so forth.
Oh, Richard, I think you're covering up the microphone right now. You've kind of faded away.
Okay.
Oh, okay. What
Um,
was the last thing
and
you said?
so the problem with books printed in the 1880s through the early 1900s, 1920s, and 30s is that the paper had acid in it. And so with time, the paper becomes very brittle. And so books from those days, they don't last nearly as long. Whereas here you have a book that's almost 400 years old and the paper is just perfect.
Wow. And so for you, because obviously we see you have so many books, is there, do you have a personal favorite, or is there a personal highlight in the collection for you that has a special, either a special story or a special resonance for your, just for your journey as a writer and as a reader?
Well, every book can teach you something, even some of the worst books. There is no completely terrible book. There are some books that are better than others, obviously, but every book can teach you something. The book that there were a few books that got me started with book collecting. See if I can find them. One of them was Tavernier Travel.
Okay, the famous French gem merchant.
Yes, and Tavernier made a number of voyages from Europe to India. And you've all heard about the French blue diamond, which my friend Richard Hughes has written a wonderful book about.
Yep.
But I had a friend who went to India and he came back with an Indian reprint of Tavernier's travels. And I started reading that, and there were some really funny things in the book. And later, when I saw some later English translations, I found that those sort of funny things had been removed from the book because the Victorian English found them to be just too shocking, and you couldn't put that in it. And so that was one of the things that got me interested. The other thing was a book by George Frederick Kunz. And Kunz was probably the most famous apologist.
Oh, I think you covered the mic again.
Pardon? I've covered the microphone again?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Kunz was probably the most famous gemologist in the United States in the 19th, early 20th century. And all of his books are exceedingly collectible today, not just because they are high quality scholarship, and they're all exceptional in that regard. But in addition, many of them are beautiful books to hold. And I think probably the most beautiful of them is the Book of the Pearl. And when I saw a copy of the original edition of the Book of the Pearl, I was exceedingly impressed. I have a couple copies of it. This is a later second printing, but it has this beautiful poem written by Kunz, and I don't know if you can see it here.
Yeah.
Can you read it?
Sort of. Maybe though, if people are on phones.
I will read it to you.
Okay.
It says at the end, it says, "Pearls are tears by angels shed to give mortals joy."
Oh.
And when you have something like that written in the book, it makes it all the more special, particularly when it's written by the author himself. Kunz's books were all beautiful examples of scholarship, but also beautiful examples of the bookmaker's art. And as a result, his books are exceedingly collectible today. And he wrote monographs on pearls, on ivory, on rings, and two of his most famous books are The Curious Lore of Precious Stones and The Magic and Mystery of Precious Stones. And so anything by Kunz is highly collectible. And there are some people who specialize in collecting Kunz books.
Yeah, and I think those two that you mentioned are quite interesting as well, because he almost maybe singularly as an American writer is sort of picking up that same medieval thread of those kind of lapidary texts, like some of the ones that you were showing us earlier, like Agricola, and Pliny as well, just sort of like talking about the attributed characteristics of stones, whether they're true today or not. But he was kind of also following, am I right in saying that, kind of following in the footsteps of those previous lapidary writers?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other things that set Kunz apart is that his books were always referenced. And so he didn't just say things, but he told you where he got the information from. And so there are footnotes at the bottom of every page saying, well, it comes from here, it comes from here. And the Book of the Pearl itself has a bibliography of some 20 or 30 pages at the end. That was incredibly unusual at that time. And even well into the 20th century, where you pick up a book by Anderson or by Webster or even Gubelin, and they'll make statements about things, but they won't tell you where they learned that, or if they learned it themselves, or if they read it somewhere. In some cases they do, but in most cases they don't. And so Kuhn's really set the pattern for high scholarship, 100 years before almost anyone else. And certainly Johnson Kankis picked up that as well. And then Gems and Gemology magazine, when Alice Keller took over, continued that tradition. And I've tried to follow that as well. Very few of us discover a lot of things ourselves. Most of the time we find something that somebody else has already discovered. And it's important to give credit to those people who have come before.
So I guess we can really thank Kuntz for that trend, because I know from my limited perspective that trying to do research when someone hasn't given you any footnotes is super challenging, because you just can't go anywhere from that point.
That's right. That's right. And so Kuntz was one of the first to really start doing that. He wasn't the only one, but he certainly took it to a further degree than most other authors at that time.
And so I know you've got one other book that I personally really love, and it's kind of the reason why I first came over and saw this collection in the first place, is your copy of Debut and his I don't even know the name of it, actually. I never even think of the title, but his
Gemerum Lapidum Historia.
Yes, exactly. So this book is
this is a book that's also, I'll lay it on top of the Hoover book so that you can see Hoover, when he published his book in vellum, he was copying this old style of how books used to be published. And the Debut book is also done in vellum, which again, I think is a kind of a sheepskin, a young sheepskin or something like that. Maybe Richard Weiss, who I believe is listening in, could tell us exactly what it is. But this was the old way of publishing books. It was a common way of binding them. And there are 3 editions. And Richard Weiss, he says, sheep or goat. There you go. Thanks, Richard. And so there are 3 editions of Debut's book. Their first edition, I think, is 1609.
Yeah.
And then there was a 1636 edition. And then there is a 1642 edition. And so the most valuable ones are the first edition and the 3rd edition, because the 3rd edition actually has another book bound into it with it by a Dutch author named Toll, Toll. And let me see if I can find the pages, Justin, that you're interested in, because you're interested in the cutting stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So which edition is the one that you have?
I have the 1642 edition. I once had a 1636 edition as well, but I sold that. This is the other book that's bound with it, which is a discussion of Theophrastus, who was even before Pliny. And so let me see if I can find the plates on the cutting that you're interested in.
Yeah, so for anyone in the audience that doesn't know about this book, so Debut now is kind of remembered as the sort of the grandfather or the godfather of modern gemology, because he was really one of the first people in the Renaissance to go around and, instead of just talk about these sort of magical uses of gemstones which had been sort of handed down through the generations, he was actually going around Europe and looking at different mines and trying to figure out how do gemstones really get formed, as opposed to the thinking of that time was basically just like God put them under the earth for us to find. He was really thinking about plate tectonics and geological pressures and forces and stuff like that. And of course, what Richard's showing us right now, this excellent chapter on gem cutting originally from 1609. And that picture on the left, we can see this hand-cranked gem cutting machine, which they were using in Prague in the court of Rudolf II at that time. To me, as a gem cutting researcher, this is probably one of my favorite books, even though there's no English. The sad thing of this book to me is there's no English translation. So all I can really do is Google Translate passages at a time, and it takes a long time. But even just for the pictures, the book is amazing, and there's quite a few of them. It's not just a few pages, but there's several plates throughout the book. And I love your copy, Richard, because you have a few of those that we just flipped through. You have the fold out, those fold out pages that give you, I forget what, like layers of geology or something like that, if I remember correctly.
Yes, and then there's also a table of different um, uh, sort of a group species variety of gemstones, an early version of that. But someone was asking, what is the title of the book? And this is the title page. And as I said, this is the 1642 edition. The book was originally published in 1609.
Yeah. And one great thing as far as being a researcher today, so many of these really old books are now up online at archive.org, and you don't, even if you have a copy, like you obviously have many of these old books, but if you don't want to open them up and finger them and damage the binding and whatever, you can just go through the PDFs, which are also searchable, which that makes life
Yeah,
easier.
yeah. I mean, when I first started writing, I was forced to go to libraries, or I would even pay friends to go to libraries and copy books for me. And there's something to be said for that, because you'll often find things with kind of a serendipitous discovery, things that you weren't looking for, that you never thought about. So there's something good in that. But certainly the internet has made things a lot easier to get copies, particularly of old and rare books. While we're on the subject of early gemological thought, I definitely want to show you another book, which is very little known in the Western world, but it's one of the, if not the most important book on gemology ever published. And that was published by Al-Biruni. And this book was, around 1,000 years ago. Al-Biruni published.
Oh, you covered the mic again. We lost.
Okay.
Sorry.
Biruni published dozens of books, and one of them was an entire book on precious stones. And this is remarkable because Al-Biruni was a real empiricist. He didn't just take things at face value and repeat what other people had said, but he actually tested them. And so as an example, he measured the specific gravity of spinel, and he measured the specific gravity of corundum, and he said they are different, therefore they are different stones. This is 1,000 years ago.
Wow.
That he did.
So he was really ahead of his time.
Oh, really ahead of his time. Now this is an English, thank God there's an English translation of this. It was done by a man in Pakistan. And this is an absolute wonderful book, full of interesting information. He describes the heat treatment of rubies in Sri Lanka.
Wow.
And he doesn't just describe them, but he actually describes the temperatures that they were using. He describes how you put rubies into a crucible and you heat them to the temperature at which you would melt gold.
Wow.
And so it's incredible. And you want to hear something really wild, but there's one writer who has basically said Al-Biruni discovered America. Now, of course, Al-Biruni was born in Central Asia. He never went anywhere near America, so how could he discover America? Well, he did things like he measured the circumference of the Earth to a surprising degree of accuracy. He was a mathematician as well. And he estimated the distance between the Earth and the sun to a surprising degree of accuracy. And he took all the maps that were known of the world about the time he was living, which was in 980 to 1000 AD. And he looked at the maps, and he knew, because he had measured the circumference of the Earth, so he knew roughly the size of the Earth. And he said, this doesn't make sense. We have all this landmass that we know about on this side of the Earth. And if there was nothing on the other side, then that would cause a wobble in the rotation of the Earth, and the Earth would spin recklessly out of control. And so 1,000 years ago, he said, there has to be something over there on the other side. And so, forget about Columbus. You can think about Al-Biruni as the man who discovered the Americas.
Wow.
In theoretical terms.
So this is also a great response to the arguments of flat earthers. We just need to show them this book.
That's right. So somebody said, who is the author? Al-Biruni. And he wrote an entire book about India as well, describing India. He was one of the most extraordinary scientists in history. And his book on gems is incredible.
I was just going to say, who's the translator, but I think we can see it.
His name is Saeed, Hakim Mohammed Saeed. Right there.
Okay. And is this a rare one, or is this something that we could actually find?
No, you can actually get copies of this. It's been reprinted in India. You can get copies.
I think we lost you again.
Okay, I said everyone should have a copy of this. If you're going to have a copy of Webster or Anderson or Kuhn's, you should definitely have a copy of Al-Biruni.
And so the fact that we know about this book and that it exists, this kind of contributes to the idea that there were, because this is going back to the days of the Silk Road. And so we can kind of imagine that probably a lot of this sort of, proto-scientific information would have been able to come into Europe from a source like this and help to contribute to, medieval Europe's idea about what was going on in the world for people like De Boot or his contemporaries.
Absolutely. I mean, when the Greeks were, in full reign, there were books like Theophrastus. There was a lot of information. There was a lot of discovery, and this was the early days of science in the Western world. And then the Romans came along, and they extended it further. Pliny, in his book, he talked about how he had dozens of books in his library that were just devoted to the treatment of gemstones. Unfortunately, none of those books have survived. But there was an incredible amount of knowledge that was being discovered in the Mediterranean area during that period. And then Europe entered, what we call the Dark Ages. And a lot of the libraries were burned. The early Christians decided that there was only one book worth worrying about, and that was the Bible. And so the early libraries that had been amassed in various parts of the Western world, Mediterranean world, were destroyed. Thankfully, in the Arab world, many of those books were preserved. And so a lot of what we know about early science in Greek and Roman times is because these works were preserved in Arabic in the Arab world.
Interesting. And then, so then a lot of that stuff would have then just come back later, whether it be via the Silk Road or when Constantinople fell. I know a lot of those old texts came back into Italy at that time and kind of kicked off the Renaissance with some of that philosophy that they hadn't really thought about for 1,000 years or whatever.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
So this is.
And then because of the Silk Road, you had commerce between the Eastern world and the Western world. And that was one of the major reasons why the Eastern and Western worlds progressed more quickly than other places in the world, because they were one continuous continent. And as Jared Diamond has written about in his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, the fact that you had a continent that stretched east and west gave super advantages to the people who lived in that continent.
Mm.
They could travel continuously with their pack animals and with their crops, and they could travel great distances. Whereas if you were in Africa, if you were in sub-Saharan Africa and you tried to travel north, you ran into the Sahara Desert, and your crops, your animals would not survive. And the same was true in the Americas. And so the fact that Europe and Asia, which is basically one big continent, the fact that it extends east and west gave a huge advantage to the people living there. Not only could they travel, but by traveling, they could learn new things from other people. And in addition, they would develop immunity to diseases because they were traveling, which of course has real importance to us today when we talk about immunity. And so the Europeans and Asians developed a higher degree of immunity, and they also had a more advanced culture and civilization because they could share their ideas with so many more people. And so that was hugely important in giving them an advantage over people on other continents.
Mm-hmm. Super interesting, and it's kind of a side of history that we haven't really thought about in terms of, you know, that advantage that you're talking about, as well as the preservation of these ancient sort of scientific or philosophical texts in the Arab world. It's really something that we haven't really heard so much about. Since you have this kind of, you know, because your collection is so big and vast, and you have this access to all this old knowledge and old information, would you say that, you know, what's in some or all of these books is still useful today? Like, would you still go back and look at this book or Debut or any of the other ones versus, you know, something that was written in the last 10 or 20 years?
Oh, of course. You know, when you look through these old books, you constantly discover things that you thought people didn't know about back then. And then you say, oh, wow, it's amazing that they knew about that. Just recently, I was writing an article about spinel inclusions, and I found a quotation from B.W. Anderson, who never really struck me as an artistic person. I've read most of what he's written. He was a famous gemologist at the London Chamber of Commerce lab. But he wrote something very beautiful about art, and he said, an ordinary person can look at something and then they see something that's just ordinary. The difference between an ordinary person and an artist is when an artist looks at that, they see something different and they show it to you in a way that you've never seen it before. And that's really the essence of art. And I was surprised to read that in something that B.W. Anderson had written.
Mm. So somebody had asked, what about Chinese and American literature? I mean, I know we mentioned Kuntz, but are there some notable Chinese, you know, it's like older Chinese books about stones or older American books talking about gemstones and gemology?
Well, I mean, take America to start with. Of course, there are the Kuntz books.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And that would have been
and
early 1900s, right? And late 1800s for him.
late 1800s, the 1880s and forward. And so Kuntz's first book was Gemstones of North America. That was written, I think, in the 1880s, early 1880s. But there were others. There were people like Furtwanger and others who wrote books about gemstones. There are books about Mount Mica. Let me see if I can find some of those. Hamlin. Okay, they had a big strike of tourmaline in Maine in the 1800s, late 1800s. And so Hamlin wrote a couple books, History of Mount Mica. And then he wrote a wonderful little book that's just called, very directly, it's called The Tourmaline.
Okay.
And so, try to get out of the light here so you can see it. And so there were a number of books that were written in the Americas in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, in Europe, even more so. Max Bauer wrote his spectacular book, Edelsteinkund, and that book is here. Okay. And that was translated into English. This is another book that's not hard to find. And it has this beautiful half leather binding and marbled end papers. And you can find copies for $500 or $600. And reprints, of course, are easily available. That's one of the finest books written about gemology in the late 19th century.
Yeah.
A lot of good information in there.
And I know he speaks
and
a
then,
fair bit about gem cutting as well. That book's been pretty useful to me in my own cutting history research.
yeah, I mean, it is a fantastic book. And then, of course, books in China, the biggest problem with the Western world and China, of course, is the language. Very few people can read Chinese. And so because of that, a lot of the knowledge in China has been a lot of the knowledge of China unknown in the Western world.
Mm-hmm.
But there are books on gems in China. And for example, this is a reprint of a well-known book from the 17th century. And it actually is notable for a plate that shows the mining of jade in Hertian in Western China. And so it's all about, it's like an encyclopedia, like Pliny. And there are dozens of these kinds of books that are largely unknown in the Western world because they've never been translated into a European language.
But for the Chinese readers, there's probably a fair amount of literature that could be found.
Yeah, absolutely. And, China has such a huge history. It's the oldest continuously surviving civilization on Earth. I mean, you had other civilizations like Mesopotamia and so forth. They've risen and they've fallen. China is the only one that's continuously survived, going on, 8,000 years. And so there's a huge body of literature in Chinese. And a lot of Chinese people know about it, but not a lot of people in the West know about it.
Hmm.
And so there's so much in the way that has been discovered, so much medical discovery that is unknown in the Western world. I've talked about this in some of my lectures. I mean, here's an illustration from the 1700s of a gem pit.
Oh, wow.
Looks kind of like it looks today, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen some stuff like this in Sri Lanka and Cambodia, like lowering the guy down on a sort of spindle thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's an interesting illustration. It's a miner who's been overcome by vapor.
Oh, wow.
And so a
how
lot of
old is,
this stuff,
how old is
yeah, a lot of this, and you were talking about cutting. Well, here's a 17th century illustration of cutting jade.
Oh, wow. I've not seen that one. Okay, I got to add that one to my list.
Yeah. So there's lots of interesting stuff that is waiting to be discovered in the Western world about China and what the Chinese knew. Probably the person who's done more in that regard to spread the knowledge of China is Joseph Needham. And I do have a couple things of interest from him. He was a professor at Cambridge University, and see if I can find this. And he met a Chinese lady, and they had an affair that continued for the rest of his life. And after he got to know her, he decided that he would learn Chinese. And he was quite a brilliant guy. And he taught himself Chinese. And during World War II, the Chinese government asked him for help, asked the British government for help because the Japanese had invaded. And so the British sent him to China to find out what they needed in terms of help. And he became so engrossed with China and things Chinese that he decided he would write a book about the discoveries that the Chinese had made in science and civilization. And it started out as one book, and he worked on it the rest of his life, and it's still being added to today. And it turned into something like 27 volumes.
Oh, wow.
Of basically things that were first discovered in China. And the book is called Science and Civilization in China. And I have one of the volumes here, which is the volume that deals with the earth sciences and things like mining.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you look through some of his work, you would be amazed at all of the discoveries that were made in China. And a lot of them, of course, have never been known outside of China. I'm looking for one book in particular. It's a biography about him. And I think I may have loaned it to a friend of mine. But in any event, so there's a huge body of literature in Chinese. And of course, for the Chinese, there's one gem above all others, and that's jade. And so I have a number of books about jade in my library. This is kind of interesting. This is a dictionary that has a piece of Chinese jade mounted on the cover. I bought this on eBay a few months ago. I don't know, it was like $100 or something like that. Kind of fun. But the Chinese, of course, have written extensively about jade. And here are some examples of the books that pertain to that. And up here, snuff bottles and jade and more. And these are all jade in different parts of the world, New Zealand and so forth. But most of it is about jade in China, because the Chinese are the biggest lovers of jade. And so these are all books about jade. And the Chinese, of course, they were the first people to publish printed books. You know, in the West, it's considered that Gutenberg invented the printing press, but in fact, the printing press was invented in China. They found a book in a cave in Xinjiang province of China, and it actually had a copyright notice on it. And it dates to 900 and something AD.
Wow.
Well before Gutenberg.
Yeah, that's like 550 years earlier. That's incredible.
Yeah. And so China produces beautiful books. And you can see some examples here. This is a series of books on jade carving, the awards that they give every year for jade carving. And these are other books on jade. Some of them in English, some of them in Chinese. People ask me, why do you buy books in Chinese? And I say, well, it's mainly for the pictures. I can always look at the pictures.
That was one of the things that I wanted to ask you as a you know, American researcher who I'm guessing only speaks English. Is it challenging for you? Because I know in my own research, so many of the books are not in English, you know, whether you're looking at jade in China or you're looking at, you know, the history of cutting in France or Germany. There's so many books that just aren't in English. Has that been a challenge for you in terms of your research and writing?
No, absolutely. In fact, I'm working on another project as we speak, and it's a struggle. I find a paper that's written in German, for example, and I have to type out the words and put them into an online translator to make sure that I'm getting it right. So it is a struggle, no question about that. Obviously, the more languages you can speak, the better off you're going to be. And that's where, you know, the people in Europe in the 19th century, they were often taught several languages. They were often taught Latin, of course. That was a basic part of their curriculum. And then they might learn 3 or 4 other languages. Joseph Needham could speak 7 or 8 languages. And that's a huge advantage when you're doing research of any kind.
Yeah. Okay, I see I've kind of been neglecting the questions here. One of the older ones was asking, kind of going back to Pliny and some of these older texts, do you have a suggestion for one that kind of talks a bit about the ancient old world uses of gemstones for medicinal and healing? You think Pliny is the best, or is there a different one you'd recommend for the sort of more magical side of gemstone use?
There are a number of books on medicinal properties of gems. Pliny is certainly one of them. And there are different translations of Pliny. And so I have a few of those. Here are a few books on that subject. And the little red books you see here are modern translations of Pliny's books on precious stones, translated by Eichholz. And then there's this one from Valentine Ball, which my friend Lisbeth, who's a real gem archaeologist, she says, oh, it's a terrible translation. But Sidney Ball wrote some incredible stuff. And a lot of the important papers that he wrote are featured in this book. So I really like the book because it's not just a translation of Pliny, but it also has a lot of information about the early trade in precious stones. And he wrote 3 papers for the Economic Geology magazine back in the 20s and 30s. And one of them is on the prices of gems. Another is on the geographical distribution of gemstones. And a lot of that information is reprinted in that book.
Okay.
Also downloaded online nowadays, those articles. So here's, more of this kind of healy-feely stuff on gemstones. India, there are a lot of books written about, healing with gems. And, Selene,
Yeah.
and a number of other things like that. So this shelf is all earlier lapidaries or translations of earlier lapidaries. There's, the Hoover translation that's been reprinted.
Mm-hmm.
And early books, Boyle's book on gemstones. And then going down here, you have other books on the history of gemstones. Of course, India, there were a lot of books written about gems because India was such an important place for gemstones. In fact, the Europeans generally believed that all of the finest stones came from India. And in India, the people were certainly the greatest collectors of gems. And so because of that, I have a serious collection of books about Indian jewelry because they were the greatest collectors.
Yeah.
And so particularly in the Mughal period, and the Maharajas and all of that. And so I generally try to buy anything I can find on Mughal jewelry because so much of it was gem set jewelry. And so, books like that.
And somebody else had asked good references for gem treatments. I think they were talking about ancient ones, but maybe we can say ancient ones and modern ones if you have a suggestion.
Well, the Nassau books, which I think I don't have here, they're down at my office. Well, here I've got the first edition, Gemstone Enhancement by Kurt Nassau. That's the classic. And that Kurt went into a lot of detail about early treatments going back to Roman times. And so there's some terrific information in that book. That's a kind of a must-have. So those are important books.
Yeah. And then going back to Jade, we had one question asking, in some of those older books about Jade from China, have you found descriptions that include materials that we don't now know or that we don't now describe as Jade?
Oh yeah, because Jade in China was never defined in the Western mineralogical sense. Jade was defined by its virtues. And so if a stone had certain virtues, it was considered to be a type of jade. And so there were 4 major types of jade traditionally in China. One of them is the Hurtian jade, which we would call mutton fat jade or the nephrite jade from Western China. And then there's another stone that's called Dushan jade that comes from Hebei province in a place called Namyang, I believe it's called. And that's actually a rock that's a mixture of zoisite and a few other things. And then another stone that they considered to be a type of jade is turquoise. So the Western mineralogy definition of jade, which some people have said to me, why do you use jade to describe things that we would never call jade? And I think you have to have a broad mind about this. The Western definition of jade in and of itself is a bastardized definition. We don't have any other gemstone where we have 2 entirely different minerals and we give it the same name. Jade is the only one that I can think of.
I mean, maybe there are others somebody else could think of, but I can't think of it.
Mm.
So the Western definition of jade is already a bastard child. And so why should we limit ourselves in our definitions? So that's something to think about.
Yeah, it's sort of old fashioned. I mean, it's kind of like thinking about, in the Renaissance time when there was so many different types of ruby, which we now know are, could be spinel, could be garnet, could be actually ruby. And we've sort of cleaned that up now. We wouldn't make that mistake anymore. So it's kind of funny that we're still doing that same thing with jade, even in the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of ruby, the vast majority of pieces that were called ruby in the past, and if you read Pliny and Theophrastus and all that, the 99.999% of those stones were actually garnet.
Okay.
Okay. And so the term ruby, as Vince has rightly pointed out in some of his writings, the first real ruby in the world was spinel.
Mm.
And the stone that we actually thought was ruby is actually spinel.
Interesting.
And it was only much later. I mean, the Arabs, they had a stone that they called spinel, and then they had another stone that they called ruby. And I believe the ruby, what we would call ruby today, was actually, they called it yakut. They knew the difference in hardness. Of course, any cutter, if you put it on the wheel, you'll immediately feel the difference between a ruby and a spinel. So they did know a lot about the stones themselves. Yeah, for what that's worth.
Another good question that just came up. Are there many old books on crystallography? And if so, when were they published?
Well, the modern crystallography started in the 1700s, largely in the 1700s in France. And so Hauy and Romé de Lille developed some of the earliest thoughts on crystallography, what we would call modern crystallography. Hauy was working with calcite, and there's a very famous illustration of him holding a rhomb of calcite, and he had a little goniometer in his hand as well. You may have seen that picture. Mm. But he noticed that whenever you broke calcite, it broke in a certain way where the angles were always the same. And so he hypothesized that every crystal was made of a building block that was a certain shape with certain angles, and that's how a crystal was built. He actually was seeing cleavage, which is a completely different thing, but that idea of the unit cell started with him. And he did write a book about gemstones too, but he wrote many books about mineralogy. There are some of the most collectible books. I do have his book on gems. Somewhere. Yeah. I mean, another early English book on gems is Thomas Nichols. And so let's see if I can show this to you. Okay, that's the book on top. Let me open it up. And this was published in the 1600s. Okay, it's called A Lapidary or the History of Precious Stones. And 1600 and
with this one, are we now entering that period of time where the paper isn't very, isn't very good? Because it seems like this one's a lot more.
No, actually, it's just a torn page.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, any book, if you tear the paper, it'll tear.
Yeah.
But we did write this book, which is one of his later books, but it's totally devoted to gemstones.
Okay.
And so this was written in the early 1800s. But he and Romé de Lisle developed, let's see, this is written in 1817. They developed pretty much what we would call modern crystallography. The thing is that to understand minerals and crystallography, you need a few things. You need to be able to break something down. And so chemistry started to advance tremendously in the 1700s. And then in the 1800s, it advanced even more quickly. And this is why you have the first synthetic stones appearing in the 1800s, because they were able to take a gem like ruby and break it down into its chemical components. And once you knew what it was made of, then you could see if you could assemble something yourself. And that was the alchemist's dream, of course. Their dream was to take lead and turn it into gold. But also to be able to manufacture a synthetic ruby or an emerald was another idea that people had been trying to do for thousands of years. And so that was one of the big developments, was the chemistry knowledge. The other big development didn't happen until the early 1900s with the invention of X-rays. And then when they started bombarding crystals with X-rays, for the first time, they had light of a wavelength that was small enough that it could be diffracted by the atoms in a crystal. And so if you put a piece of film next to the stone and you bombarded it with X-rays, the X-rays would diffract in a pattern that was a representation of the crystal structure. And so those things, first the chemistry and then the development of X-rays, gave birth to modern crystallography and crystal chemistry.
Interesting. Did not ever know about that. So, obviously we see that you have an incredible collection of books just in your house. How has this helped you, in terms of being a book lover and a book collector? Has this had a lot of influence for you in terms of wanting to write books, or is it just a necessity that you needed a lot of books in order to do your research?
I think it goes both ways. I think that as you decide that you want to write something, I mean, in my case, I was discovering things and I didn't write about them, and then I saw other people write about the same things later. And I realized, gee, I should have written about that myself. And then when you start writing, then you realize, well, I have to make sure that what I'm writing is correct. And so you need to study more about the subject to make sure that you're on solid ground. And the other thing for anyone who wants to write, one of the most important things you can do is to have mentors that can help you in your writing, not just the activity of writing to improve the quality of your writing, but also to check your work and make sure that it's factually accurate. And so I've benefited tremendously from having a few different mentors in my life. And nowadays, I rarely publish anything unless it's been checked by at least one other person whose knowledge I respect. So people like John Emmett have been a tremendous help to me, because I'm not a trained scientist. I never went to university. And so I don't have any, formal scientific training. So it always helps to run things by somebody like that. The other person who's been a huge influence on my writing is Bill Larson. Um, Bill is trained as a mining engineer, but he's been collecting minerals since he was 10 years old. And if you think that my library is something, well, Bill's is that times 10. He has one of the finest mineral libraries in the world. And so I was fortunate to work with Bill for a number of years. And I would often run things by him before I published them. And he always gave me solid advice.
I think that, and that's good advice for all of our audience watching as well, for anyone who's doing research or wants to get into doing research. I know for me, when I came into Bangkok, I first met Vincent, and Vincent told me, even at that time, you know, Richard Hughes is my mentor. You know, he was that guy for me, and for Vincent, and now Vincent's been that guy for me. But I think it's really important, because it's very easy as a novice to go and do some research and think that it's good and just put it out, whether it's, you know, on the internet or wherever it goes. But it's also very easy to make a very silly mistake, and you sort of ruin your reputation before you even get started. Um,
Yeah.
by being a
I
bad
mean,
author.
one of the biggest, I mean, the internet is a wonderful tool. And at the same time, one of the biggest problems of the internet is with desktop publishing is that people who have never had any kind of training in typography or page layout, they think that they can do those jobs. And you really need training to do that kind of thing. The other thing is that traditional publishing, there were always editors. And much of what is published today online lacks that curation of a good editor. And that's so important. The editor, a good editor will not try to change your work willy-nilly, but they will try to improve your work and make it even better. And that's why in science, the peer review process is so important, because you know, you put your heart and your soul into writing something, and then it gets sent off to these anonymous people who try to tear it to pieces. And they do that out of love of the work, not out of ego.
Yeah.
And you have to accept that they're actually trying to make your work even stronger. And so anyone who has published anything in a peer-reviewed journal, you know, it's kind of a love-hate situation where nobody likes to hear their work criticized. But the best thing you can do is take that criticism to heart, because they are actually trying to help you.
It's definitely a good challenge for the young ego, because you quickly learn that you don't know everything that you thought that you knew, or at least not the best way to present it.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't mind, I've got some questions from, well, we have some questions in the queue, but also I have some questions that some people had emailed me over the last couple of days. I guess if we're not going to look at any more books, you could flip your camera around, and we can see what you're, or we can see you as you're talking to us. But
Okay.
I have one question that touches right on what you were just saying. So if anyone who's watching this doesn't know,
See if I can get
there's
better
a
angle.
there's a Facebook group that we're a part of that's kind of like a gemstone and I guess gemstone and jewelry book collectors group. So one of the
Yes.
members of that group had messaged this question, saying, when it comes to, you know, making a gemstone and jewelry book, it's extremely important to reproduce the color as close as possible. So how do you, Richard, as a self-publisher, make sure that the printers accomplish this? And, you know,
That is one of the most difficult things, and it's done through trial and error. The first book that I self-published, all the color separations were so bad that we had to start from scratch. And it was a very expensive process, and at a time when I didn't have a lot of money, which made it even tougher to do. But you learn this the hard way. Just like every gem dealer has a little box or a drawer full of stones that you can call their mistakes, but it's actually their experience. You learn by making mistakes. And so it's not an easy process. Nowadays, it's much easier than it used to be, because we used to shoot slide film largely, or negatives, but mostly slides, positives. And then you had to go through a scanning process. And that scanning process could either be very cheap and crappy with the results, or you had something called a drum scanner, that is a scanner that costs tens or even $100,000, and to make a single decent scan might be $50 to $100 or more for a single image.
Wow.
And so that gets very expensive very, very quickly. Nowadays, everything is digital, and so we no longer have to go through the scanning process, and we have better proofing printers. But with any printer, you have to work with a good printer, and they will show you proofs, and you have to look and see if it matches what you want. With gemstones, the difficulty is that so many of the finest gemstones cannot be printed. The colors are out of gamut. And we've written about this in our different publications. And so the biggest problem with ruby and sapphire is blue sapphire, particularly the blue sapphire, like a fine mogo blue, like a royal blue color. It can't be printed. And so you have to accept that. You just try to get it as good as you can. We try to fix that problem to a degree by adding a fifth color. And so we print on a printing press that's a 6-color press. And the fifth color is a spot color that is added to try to juice up the blue and make the blue a little bit better looking. The other color is very difficult to print is an emerald green.
Yeah.
And so those are the two biggest problem areas in printing. But it's just you work with a printer that is good, that has experience, and then you have to let them guide you as to what is possible and what is not.
And I know I've seen you post recently, I think when you were working on the Inside Out book that you guys just released, I thought you had posted one picture on social media somewhere where you're actually at the printer, like checking colors or color matching or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. You have to do that. And so typically when we print our books, we sit on the press, meaning that we're down there watching the pages come off the press, making sure that each, what they call a form, each form is matching the color the way we hope it will. And so they will lay out the proof. And in the printing business, it's called a signature proof for a reason, because customers have the nasty habit of after something is printed, they say, no, it looks wrong. And so that's why they give you a proof and they have you sign it, which means that you have approved this and your signature is there. And so when you say, no, you did it wrong, then they bring out that signature proof and they say, how is it different than this? And so you know, fine quality printing is a job for experts. A top quality printing press is millions of dollars just for a single press. And you have to work with people that know what they're doing.
So do you think, because I mean, we know just from your career, you've put out like maybe a dozen books, I think, or I know that there's that picture of the stack of books on the back of the Lotus flyers that are a lot of yours. As a book collector, has that, and a book lover, has that kind of fed back into your publishing ethos? Like, do you really try to go the extra mile to create something not necessarily collectible, but just something precious?
Absolutely. We are exceedingly concerned about quality. I'll give you an example. John Quavela's Photo Atlas series. The quality of the work inside the books is extraordinary, far beyond what any one person should have been able to create. And the sad thing is that the printer put a cheap binding on it. And so the boards on each of those volumes are far too thin to hold the weight of the book. And so I actually have 3 different sets of the Photo Atlas. One set I try not to open at all because I know if I open it too much, the binding will break.
Yeah.
And then I have another set that I use every day. So we try to produce books that will withstand the test of time. If a book is produced well, it should last hundreds of years. As I have shown you with some of these books this evening, that some of these books are hundreds of years old and they're still going strong.
Yeah. So it's kind of a testament to the quality of the workmanship back then. But of course, maybe even the price of things back then was a little bit on a different scale as well.
Yes. Yeah. Anyway, so we try to produce books that will last. Our Gemologist Guide is a very heavy book, as you know, and the boards on that book are twice as thick as the boards on the Photo Atlas series, as an example. And what a lot of people don't understand is that the most important part of the binding of a book is the end papers, because the end papers are what hold the book to the boards. And so the end papers are, let me see if I can show you this. It's this paper here. Okay.
That first heavy
the paper that's attached to the cover. That has to be strong enough to hold the weight of the book on the shelf. And so if you cut corners on the end papers, it won't do good for the book.
Yeah. One of the questions that came up a while back, are you working on another book right now? I know Inside Out, your guys' awesome visual journey just came out just a few months ago. Do you already have something else in the works?
We're always working on different projects, but we've always felt, you know, every time I talk about something that I want to do, I get in trouble. Because then if I don't end up finishing it, it's not good. So I learned that early on in my career. I'll talk about things when they're done, but not while I'm working on them.
Okay. And so one interesting question that is in there, do you think that there's still more to write about in the world of gemology? Like, is there new topics that haven't been covered yet, or just small idiosyncrasies, you know, in the corners? Or is there?
Oh, no. The best thing about gemology, somebody asked a question, do we use acid-free paper? Yes, we do.
Okay.
And it just on that topic also, paper has a grain to it. And so you can fold a piece of paper with the grain, you shouldn't fold it against the grain. All of these things come into play when you're printing books. But anyway, are there things to be discovered in gemology? Of course. One of the beauties of gemology is that there's so little that's been studied. And so, I mean, when I was younger, I used to travel quite often to Nepal. And I would hear people complain, oh, there's too many tourists, blah, blah, blah. But if you've ever been in the mountains in Nepal, you realize that all you need to do is walk a few meters off the trail, and you will have a full wilderness experience. And gemology is like that. You only need to go a little bit off the beaten track, and you'll be in completely uncharted territory. And that's one of the greatest things about gemology.
Yeah. So let me see if there's any, I know there's a few questions here that are asking about stuff that we already said. I just put this out there that this video or this dialogue is going to be on YouTube probably tomorrow. So if any of you guys want to go back and take screenshots of the individual book titles, let's not reiterate everything that we already just said, but someone asked any thoughts on the work of Kurt Nassau.
Kurt Nassau? Yeah, I touched earlier on his book on treatments.
Yeah.
Kurt was one of the greatest scientists ever to be involved with gemology. And we're blessed that he took an interest in gemology. He was worked at Bell Laboratories and was working with lasers and things like that. And so he wrote a book on synthetic gemstones that was fantastic, called Gems Made by Man. his book on treatments, again, fantastic.
Yeah.
He wrote another book called The Physics and Chemistry of Color, where he detailed a lot of the causes of color in gems and minerals. And then he wrote dozens and dozens of articles in various journals and magazines like Lapidary Journal on the history of synthetic stones, Geneva rubies, history of treatments, and so forth. So he was extremely prolific. I was privileged to get to know him a little bit before he passed away. He was quite a guy.
Okay. And I'm just looking, there's a few questions that are a little bit off topic, but this one's a bit interesting. So going back to that, the book Most Comprehensive in Knowledge of Precious Stones, the old Arabic one, someone had asked what type of information is in there that we might not find in a like actual modern gemology book. Is there some stuff that he says that nobody else covers?
Well, it's not so much the stuff that he says as when he said it.
Okay.
I mean, he was saying this stuff hundreds and hundreds of years before anyone in Europe, and for that matter, anyone in Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and he had a great sense of humor as well, which comes through in his writing. But he has, huge chapter on trading in pearls. And there's just, if you sit down, you read the book, there's just an incredible amount of knowledge. People think, well, we know everything there is to know, and we learned this all in the last 100 years. That's not the case. People had incredibly inquisitive minds going way, way back.
Yeah.
And they made some incredible discoveries.
Is there any books that you'd recommend for the like, let's say, gem lover or gemologist about the geological side of things?
There is a book written by John Quavala and an Australian gemologist. Let me grab it. This book is excellent, and it's got lots of photos, and just about anything you would want to know about geology is in here in a very accessible format. And so this one I can highly recommend.
Okay. It looks pretty well laid out too, like kind of.
Oh yeah, beautiful book. And then one of my favorite authors is a guy named John Saul. And people may know him because he discovered a mine that bears his name in Kenya, the John Saul Ruby Mine. John is one of the most original thinkers in our field or in any field. And he's written this book called A Geologist Speculates that is absolutely fascinating. And he has made this available on our website, lotusgemology.com, as a free download. So if you don't want to buy the paper book, you can download the whole book as a PDF for free.
Oh, that's cool.
And it's one of the most interesting books I've ever read because John is a kind of guy that he asks these really big questions. He asks questions like, who are we? Why are we here? How did we get here? And the answers that he comes up with are some of the most unusual and interesting of anybody I've ever read. So I highly recommend his work. He's written another little tiny book, which I think is with my daughter right now, and so I don't have it to show you, about the stork and the origins of the idea of the stork bringing children.
Okay.
And it's an idea that cuts across all cultures. And in that book, he points out things like if you look at the DNA evidence of human beings, you find that the humans that come from Western Africa share more DNA with the people of China than the people of Western Africa share with the current occupants of East Africa.
Wow.
Because at some point, the people of West Africa left and they spread around the world and they populated the entire world, including the Americas. And the people of East Africa basically didn't move anywhere. And so these kind of ideas are absolutely fascinating. And John writes a lot about that kind of stuff in a fairly accessible form. So I can highly recommend this book.
Yeah. And so,
which
and
will
so
give
we
you a
can,
whole different take on humanity and where we come from.
and so that one we can download from your website, so we don't even need to
Yes, you
try
can.
and- Cool.
Yes, you can.
Okay. Someone had asked, what's the plastic that you wrap the books in? For
You know, somebody asked about, do we print on acid-free paper? Yes, we do. Because we don't want to have happen what happened in the late 19th century. And so this plastic material on these books is an acid-free plastic that just protects the book. If you are a collector, of course, condition is everything.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a chance to buy a book and there's more than one copy available, you always want to try to buy the book in the best condition because it'll be much more valuable in the future. And particularly if the book has a dust jacket, sometimes the dust jacket is worth more than the book itself.
Because they're rare.
Because people tend to throw away the dust jacket. And so, when a dust jacket is available, you want to try to get it. And then when you have it with a dust jacket, then you want to protect it. And so there's a company in the United States called Brodart, Brodart, and they make protective covers for books. And we buy them in rolls, and we put them on all of our most valuable books.
And so one question I was thinking about earlier in relation to that, since you have this incredible library here in Bangkok where it's obviously very humid and hot, do you take special care, or do you have to have special conditions in your house to be able to not like age them, you know, more than necessary?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the books that you will buy in Asia, I'm mainly thinking Southeast Asia, Burma, India, the heat and humidity is a big problem. And so if you can find books in America or in Europe, they will often be in better condition, older books, because they haven't been stored in the kind of heat and humidity that you typically find in South Asia and Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm.
So that's certainly a consideration. You know, my books are stored here in my home. Obviously, we turn the air conditioning on every day. We don't run it 24/7, but you don't need to do that.
Okay.
And they're kept in relatively dry conditions, whereas books that are 50 years old, 75 years old, that were left in India or in Southeast Asia, you'll often find mold, you'll find wormholes, things like that, and that can be a problem. One of the ways to kill mold is to just put the book in the freezer.
Interesting.
Put it in a plastic bag and put it in the freezer for a couple weeks. That's one of the things that I do sometimes.
Interesting. Okay, and so I'll just do a couple more questions and then we'll wrap it up because it is getting a bit late here. We were talking about treatments earlier. Somebody asked your opinion on Ted Temelis's heat treatment of Ruby and Sapphire book.
Uh-huh.
Is that
Yeah, there are very few books on heat treatment, and so there's not a lot of choice. That's pretty much the only one.
okay? And what was one I just saw? We were talking about Jade and so much that's been written on Jade, and all the types of books, or all the books in Chinese language that aren't available to us non-Chinese readers. But someone had asked, are there a lot of books about other types of stones from China? Ancient books besides Jade. Did they write about all types of stuff, or?
There are books that are written about other kinds of stones, and they're somewhat similar to the lapidaries of the Middle Ages, where they have a lot based on the medicinal and spiritual properties of the stones.
Mm-hmm.
There was often a lot of transference, like in China, something like a rhinoceros horn is supposed to cure impotence,
Mm-hmm.
and that was true also in Europe in early times as well. So there's a lot of that kind of belief. I do have one book that is exceedingly rare. I've only seen one copy of it, of the original. That was a lapidary written by a Chinese man who was educated in the West. And let's see if I can find it. This is so rare that Johnson Kankis never had a copy of it. It's called Lapidarium Sinicum. And I don't know if you can see this.
Okay. What's the year on that?
1927. And so it's a description of rocks and minerals, which is because he was educated in the West. So it's a mixture of stuff, where there's the traditional Chinese stuff, and then there is the Western science as well. Unfortunately, of course, it's all in Chinese.
Okay. So you might need some help with that one.
Right. But that was maybe one of the earliest bridge volumes, where you had Western mineralogy coming together with the knowledge of gems and minerals in China.
Can you give the?
And so somebody said, what's the name of the author? His name was Chang. And he wrote a number of articles as well.
So Lapidarium Sinicum. Okay.
Yeah.
So
H.T. Chang.
Yeah. Cool.
So there is a first edition that I've never seen, never heard of anybody who's seen the first edition. This is the second edition.
So here's a really good question for anyone who wants to follow in your footsteps, or any of the collectors before you. How do you get started? I mean, where do you go to find these types of books? How do you buy books that are 1,000 years old?
Well, I don't have anything that's 1,000 years old, but like gemstones, you buy them from dealers. And so there are certain dealers that specialize in books about rocks and minerals and gems and jewelry. And that Facebook club the group that we're members of, just yesterday, one of the members posted an entire list of sources of books on gems and minerals.
Okay.
And so it was a huge list, very comprehensive. And so those are the kinds of places where you can start. And then there are also book search engines. And so, I mean, I tend to buy any monograph. A monograph is a book on a single subject. I tend to buy any monograph I can get my hands on on gemstones. So if there's a book on tourmalines, I don't even look inside, I just buy it. If there's a book on emeralds, I buy it. Because generally speaking, to put together a book on a single topic like that usually means that the author has done their homework to a degree. And you never know when you're going to need this. The project I'm working on right now is something a little further afield than what I've specialized in. But because I had always bought all these monographs, now all of a sudden, oh, gee, I just walk over to the shelf and pick it up.
Yeah.
Everything I need is right there.
Yeah.
So you never know when you're going to need these things.
So basically any subject that you want to go into, you probably already have enough background source material to just begin. That's handy.
Exactly. Exactly. And so the internet is a wonderful thing, but it's no substitute for a real library. And the other thing you have to remember is that the internet, and particularly Facebook, is so ephemeral. You don't know whether you're going to be able to read something tomorrow if it's in a digital format.
Mm.
And I've learned this the hard way. I was an early adopter of digital publishing and the internet. And now I've recognized that anything serious that I do, I want it to be printed on paper, because paper lasts forever. And digital stuff has such a short shelf life, it's almost ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, I think also too, for anyone who hasn't done it, and I hadn't really experienced this before I started to do my own research, but the experience of going into a reference library and the almost religious, not only the feeling of being surrounded by all those books, but the protocol that you have to go through to get access to some of these old and rare books. It's a unique experience. And then I don't know, I'm sure this has happened to you many times, but for me as well, the first time somebody sets a book in front of you that is 1,000 years old, and you're allowed to touch it and smell it and have this sort of tactile experience with it, it's, you know, as a book lover, it's sort of unbelievable. It's kind of like a lifetime topping experience. So
It certainly gives you a respect for books.
yeah.
And so I use the internet. There are tremendous things about the internet, but there's nothing like paper.
True. Okay, well, I think that's a perfect place to end. I know we didn't get to all the questions, and I know some of them were a little bit too gemology specific, and I didn't want to take us out of book world, but I think this is a really great place to end the evening. So I just want to thank you so much, Richard, for giving us your time and giving us access to your incredible library.
Hey,
And
well, thank you all, and thank you especially, Justin, for the forum here. And if anybody does have a specific question, I'm easy to contact. Just send me an email or something.
And I'm gonna share. Well, I just shared in the chat the address for the Gemological and Jewelry Book Club on Facebook. But
Excellent.
I'm also gonna pop up. Oh, I lost my window, but I'm gonna pop up a few links for people if they don't know them already. So yeah, I just want to thank all the audience for hanging out with us for a couple of hours. If you you know, obviously, if you want to know more about Richard, or if you want to get in touch with him, Ruby Sapphire is pretty much all of your articles, right? I know I've referenced that one a few times.
Yes, and Lotus Gemology, and
then the Instagram.
Contact me through, at richard@lotusgemology.com.
Okay.
And I also want to urge you, if you really like books, try to pick up the latest issue of Arts of Asia magazine. The entire issue is devoted to jade. And there is an article by my daughter, Billy, also interviewing one of the foremost people in the Chinese jade carving. And so the whole issue is well worth having. And there is this article about collecting books on jade as well. and that has a lot of information about collecting books.
Excellent. Okay, well, I definitely want to check that out. I hope everybody else will go find it as well. And so, yeah, if you guys want to follow, you're not doing the Lotus Instagram, right? That's Billy, I think.
That's
Or,
Billy, yeah.
but anyway, if people are on Instagram and they want to follow Lotus in general, you guys are on there as Lotus, and then and of course the websites. If you guys want to keep track of what I'm doing with these talks and stuff, I'm going to be promoting them on Instagram and Facebook. Articles are on my website, and then the school, who is kind of representing this, or whatever, hosting these talks, we're publishing stuff on Instagram as well. Thanks everybody for being here. Thanks Richard for being here. We're going to be back next week at the same time with a jeweler who has recently come to Thailand, Jason Marchiafava. So we're super excited to talk to him about hand fabricating jewelry. And yeah, so happy to be able to talk to you, Richard, for 2 hours just about books. I can't think of a nerdier topic that we could have gone into. And it seems like we could probably go for 2 more hours if we really wanted to. So thanks for...
Well, we'll do it another time.
Yeah, we can do a part 2 some other time. So, okay. Well, thank you. And thanks everybody else. And we're going to sign off here from Bangkok. And if you want to go back and see any of these book titles, I'm going to post this up on YouTube tomorrow, so you can go back and screenshot and everything like that. It looked like it was all pretty clear, so I think everyone will answer their questions that way. And for the Facebook Gemology book group, the link is in the chat. It doesn't have an easy link that I can just verbally tell you because it's a bunch of weird letters, but I'll just paste it in there right now so you can find it again. It's a bunch of numbers, so just copy and paste that group. It's in there right now, and everyone should be able to see it. So, okay, thank you, Richard, and we will see.
Thank you, Justin.
Lotus is open now, so we will see you in person in Lotus when we come in to drop off all of our stones. So,
okay, thanks.
Catch you later.